November 1951. MiG Alley, North Korea. A Soviet MiG-15 erupts into a fireball at 40,000 feet. The pilot never saw the burst coming. 1 second he was climbing untouchable, punching through the stratosphere in the fastest jet the communist world had ever built. The next second, his left wing simply ceased to exist. Shredded by .50 caliber rounds that arrived from an angle that should have been geometrically impossible. The burning wreckage corkscrewed down toward the frozen Yalu River below, trailing black smoke across a sky that was supposed to belong to him. That pilot was Captain Arkady Semyonov, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had survived 3 years of combat against the Luftwaffe, a man who had never once been surprised in the air. Until today. And he was not alone. In the space of 6 weeks across October and November 1951, Soviet pilots flying the most aerodynamically superior fighter jet on the planet were being hunted out of the sky with a precision that defied every known law of aerial combat. 47 confirmed kills. Tight bullet groupings on recovered wreckage. Shots fired from ranges that the laws of ballistics said were impossible. The Soviet High Command had a name for what was happening to their pilots. They called it the zone. And they had absolutely no idea what was causing it. This is the story of a mechanical engineer in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who solved the hardest math problem in aviation history. A quiet man who never flew a single combat mission and never fired a single shot in anger. His name was Charles Stark Draper. And the weapon he built inside a small black box would not just dominate the skies over Korea. It would expose the deepest structural fault line in the Soviet Empire, a fault line that would ultimately bring the entire edifice crashing down. To understand why Draper's invention was so revolutionary, you need to understand the specific crisis that was tearing the United States Air Force apart in the summer of 1950. When the Korean War began in June of that year, American air power was supposed to be the decisive factor. The United States had the largest air force on Earth. They had pilots tempered by 4 years of brutal aerial combat against Germany and Japan. They had jet aircraft that were at the time considered cutting edge. The B-29 Superfortress bombers, the same aircraft that had incinerated Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were deployed to strike North Korean supply lines and industrial targets. For 4 months, the bombing campaign proceeded according to plan. Then, in October 1950, everything changed. Chinese forces poured across the Yalu River in massive numbers, and with them came something that the American pilots had never encountered: the MiG-15. The first time an American pilot saw one in the air, his radio transmission back to base was a single word. He said, "Silver." That was all. Because what he saw crossing in front of him, at nearly 600 miles per hour, was a silver swept-wing missile with a pilot inside it, and it was unlike anything he had ever faced. The MiG-15 climbed at 10,000 feet per minute. It had a service ceiling of 50,000 feet. It carried 2 23mm cannons and one 37mm cannon that could literally amputate a B-29's wing with a single burst. The American F-86 Sabre, the best fighter the United States had in the theater, could not match the MiG in a straight climb. It could not reach the same altitude. On paper, in every category that aviation engineers use to measure dominance, the MiG-15 was the superior aircraft. The B-29 losses became catastrophic. In October 1951, 8 B-29s were shot down in a single week. The strategic bombing campaign over North Korea essentially stopped. The most powerful bomber in the American arsenal was grounded by a Soviet jet that the Western world had not even known existed. The shock in Washington was total. But here is the paradox that set the stage for everything that followed. On the ground in the intelligence reports being compiled by frantic analysts at the Pentagon, a different story was beginning to emerge. The F-86 Sabre pilots, who were engaging the MiGs in the corridor above the Yalu, the airspace that would become known as MiG Alley, were generating a kill ratio that made no sense. Given the performance disadvantage of the Sabre, given the MiG's superior climb and ceiling, the American pilots should have been losing badly. Instead, by late 1951, Sabre pilots were posting kill claims at a ratio that suggested they were somehow turning the MiG's aerodynamic advantages into irrelevant statistics. The answer was sitting in the cockpit of every F-86 Sabre that flew into MiG Alley. It was mounted prominently on the instrument panel behind the armored glass. It looked at first glance like a standard optical gun sight. A piece of glass with a glowing circle projected on it, the kind of simple aiming device that fighter pilots had been using since World War II. It was not simple, it was not standard, and it was about to change warfare forever. Charles Stark Draper had begun working on the problem in 1944, not in Korea, but in the flak-filled skies over Germany. He was not analyzing the MiG. He was analyzing a mathematical problem that he understood would become existential the moment the jet age arrived. The problem was this. At 300 miles per hour, a skilled fighter pilot could estimate deflection. He could look at an enemy aircraft turning in front of him, intuit how far ahead to aim, and pull the trigger with reasonable success. It was an art form. Experience instinct, three-dimensional, spatial awareness refined by hundreds of hours in the cockpit. Some pilots were extraordinary at it. The great aces of World War II had this gift. But Draper ran the numbers for the coming jet age, and what he found was terrifying in its clarity. At 600 miles per hour with closing speeds approaching 1,000 miles per hour, the geometry of an aerial intercept changes faster than the human nervous system can process. The time between seeing an enemy aircraft and having a viable firing solution collapses from seconds to fractions of a second. A pilot needs to aim not where the enemy is, but where the enemy will be when the bullets arrive. At jet speeds across firing ranges of 1,000 feet or more, calculating that point requires solving a real-time ballistic equation that factors in your own speed, the target's speed, the target's turn rate, the range to target the bullet velocity, air density, and wind drift. Simultaneously, in real time, while pulling 4 times the force of gravity. Draper was blunt about his conclusion. He wrote in his lab notes that the human brain, however gifted, had reached its evolutionary limit in the jet age. Asking a pilot to calculate ballistics at Mach 0.9 was not difficult. It was biologically impossible. What the American pilot needed was not better training or a better gun. He needed a partner, a machine that could do the math that his brain could not do fast enough. The device Draper built was designated the A4 gunsight. Its heart was a component he had spent years perfecting called the floated integrating gyroscope. Imagine a precision-machined spinning rotor suspended inside a sealed cylinder filled with a specialized fluid of exact viscosity. This fluid damped out the vibrations and shock loads of a maneuvering fighter jet, allowing the gyroscope to sense the pure rotational motion of the aircraft with an accuracy that nothing else in 1950 could match. The tolerances involved in machining this component were measured in millionths of an inch, not thousandths, millionths. When the A4 sight was installed in the F-86, it fundamentally changed what the pilot was doing when he flew. In a conventional gun sight, the crosshair is fixed. It points where the nose points. The pilot aims his entire aircraft at the target and fires. In Draper's sight, the crosshair floated. The gyroscopes felt every input the pilot made, every rate of turn, every G-loading, and they moved the aiming reticle ahead of where the nose was pointing. The sight was continuously solving the deflection equation and showing the pilot the answer in real time as a glowing dot on the glass in front of his face. The pilot did not calculate anything. He chased the dot. But to solve the equation completely, the sight needed one more input. Range. Exact range to the target, not estimated, not eyeballed, measured. This was provided by a small ranging radar mounted in the lip of the Sabre's nose intake, designated the APG-30. As the American pilot closed on a MiG, the radar locked automatically and fed the exact distance into the gyroscopic computer. The loop was closed. The gyros measured the turn rate. The radar measured the distance. The computer projected the solution onto the glass. All the pilot had to do was put the glowing diamond on the silver fuselage of the MiG and squeeze the trigger. It turned average pilots into precision instruments. It turned good pilots into something the Soviets had no framework to describe. The first time the fully integrated A4 system was deployed in combat over MiG Alley in the spring of 1951, the results were immediate, and they were brutal. Soviet pilots began returning to base, those who returned at all with damage that made no sense. Bullet strikes from angles they had been pulling away from at full power. Tight groupings on their wings and fuselages from ranges where American guns had no business being accurate. Pilots who had survived the entire Eastern Front against Germany were being killed in maneuvers that should have been their sanctuary. Captain Nikolai Sutyagin, who would end the war as the highest-scoring Soviet ace of the conflict, filed a debrief in October 1951 that circulated through the entire chain of command. His account was precise and professional and deeply unsettling. He described being struck while in a high-G climbing escape that should have made him a geometrically impossible target. He described his wingman being hit with a grouping of rounds so tight it looked like the work of a ground-based precision rifle. He described in the clipped language of a Soviet military report his conclusion. The Americans, he wrote, are not guessing. They are not estimating. Something is calculating for them. That report landed on the desk of General Georgy Lobov, commander of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, and from there it traveled to Moscow, and from Moscow the order came down with the full weight of Stalin's signature behind it. Find out what is inside that black box. What followed was one of the most desperate intelligence operations of the Cold War. Recovery teams, scorched wreckage, captured pilots interrogated through interpreters in frozen North Korean basements, and the growing maddening realization that the Soviets were looking for a superweapon and finding instead something far more dangerous. Not an alien technology, not a secret beyond their comprehension. A level of manufacturing precision that their entire industrial economy had been built in the exact wrong direction to produce. The hunt was on, and it was already too late. In the autumn of 1951, Charles Stark Draper had done something that no engineer in the history of aerial warfare had ever done. He had removed the guesswork from killing. His A4 gunsight, mounted inside the cockpit of the F-86 Sabre, was turning average American pilots into precision instruments of destruction over the frozen skies of MiG Alley. Soviet aces with Eastern Front combat experience were being shot out of the sky by men half their experience level. The kill ratios were climbing. The black box was working. But Draper's problem was no longer in Korea. His problem was in Washington. Because the men who controlled the production lines, the procurement budgets, and the deployment orders were sitting in offices 3 floors above reality. And they had decided with the full authority of institutional arrogance that Charles Stark Draper's invention was a solution to a problem they did not believe existed. The United States Air Force in 1951 was an organization that had just won the largest war in human history. Its senior leadership were men who had commanded thousands of aircraft across Europe and the Pacific. They had defeated the Luftwaffe and the Imperial Japanese Air Service through a combination of superior numbers, logistical dominance, and the sheer aggressive skill of American pilots. These were men who believed with an absolute conviction that bordered on religious faith that the American fighter pilot was the decisive weapon. Not the aircraft, not the equipment, the man. And any suggestion that a machine should replace the pilot's judgment was not just technically dubious. It was an insult to the culture they had built their careers on. Brigadier General Harold Hap Colburn ran the Air Force Procurement Division responsible for cockpit avionics and weapons systems. He was 62 years old. He had flown biplanes over France in 1918. He had watched American air power evolve from canvas and wire into swept-wing jets, and he had an instinctive bone-deep suspicion of complexity. His personal philosophy, repeated to every junior officer who passed through his office, was 3 words: simple wins wars. When the preliminary performance reports from MiG Alley landed on his desk in November 1951, showing the A4 site's kill statistics, Colburn read them twice. Then he called Draper's liaison officer into his office. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. "Your machine is producing dependent pilots," Colburn said. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "A pilot who cannot calculate deflection without a gyroscope is a pilot who dies the moment that gyroscope fails. I will not build a United States Air Force on a foundation of crutches." The liaison officer, a young major named Thomas Reedy, tried to present the combat data. Colburn waved it away. "Statistics from a limited theater engagement against an enemy of unknown quality. I've seen these numbers before. They never survive contact with a real war." He stood up. The meeting was over. "Tell Dr. Draper that the Air Force appreciates his work. Tell him we'll keep the existing units in the field. We will not be expanding the program." Reedy walked out of that office with the specific feeling of a man who has just watched something important die. Full-scale production of the A4 site was frozen. The existing units in Korea would continue to operate. No new procurement, no expansion, no formal integration into the Air Force's standard equipment list. Draper's invention would remain a field experiment. And while Colburn was making that decision, 31 American pilots were killed in the air over Korea in November 1951 alone. The situation looked terminal. And then Draper found his ally. Not where he expected. Not in the Air Force. In the Navy. Commander James Hartwell was a naval aviator who had spent the previous 8 months as an exchange observer with the 5th Air Force in Korea. He had flown 12 combat missions as a backseat observer in F-86 sorties, which was technically against regulation, and which he had done anyway. He had seen the A4 site work in real combat. He had sat 3 feet behind pilots as the glowing reticle drifted onto MiG fuselages, and the guns fired, and the results arrived. He was not a theorist. He was a witness. When Hartwell returned to Washington in December 1951, he went directly to the Naval Air Systems Command with a 14-page report that he had written by hand on the flight from Japan. The report was not diplomatic. Its conclusion read, "The A4 integrated gunsight system represents the most significant advancement in aerial weapons employment since the introduction of tracer ammunition. The Air Force's decision not to expand procurement is, in my professional assessment, a catastrophic institutional error that is currently costing American lives." That report found its way to Rear Admiral Chester Pauling, who ran naval aviation procurement. Pauling was 60 years old, and unlike Colburn, he was constitutionally incapable of ignoring data that contradicted his assumptions. He called Hartwell in. He called Draper in. He listened for 4 hours. Then he said 7 words that changed the trajectory of the program. "Show me. 1 test. I'll watch personally." The conditions Pauling set were deliberately brutal. He wanted the demonstration conducted not in a controlled laboratory environment, but against actual fleet aircraft, flying combat realistic profiles. The test would take place at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland in February 1952. 3 Navy pilots with 0 experience with the A4 system would be given 30 minutes of ground instruction, then put in Sabre airframes, fitted with the sight, and tasked with achieving firing solutions against experienced aggressor pilots flying evasive profiles. If the novice pilots could not demonstrate a meaningful performance advantage over the experienced pilots using conventional sights, the program was finished. Draper had 6 weeks to prepare. He had 1 chance. The morning of February 14, 1952 was clear and brutally cold at Patuxent River. The flight line smelled of jet fuel and frozen metal. Admiral Pauling arrived at 700 with 4 members of his procurement staff, all of whom wore the specific expression of men who expected to be bored. Colburn's office had sent an observer as well, a colonel named Marsh, who stood slightly apart from the naval group with his arms crossed and said nothing to anyone. The 3 test pilots, Lieutenant Commander Frank Delaney and 2 junior lieutenants named Vogt and Simmons, had received their ground briefing the previous evening. Delaney was 34. He had 1,800 flight hours. He had never fired the A4 sight in the air. He understood the theory. He had chased the dot on a ground simulator for 3 hours. That was the entirety of his training. The aggressor pilots in the opposing aircraft were hand-selected. Both had over 2,000 hours. Both had Korean combat experience. They were flying standard evasive profiles designed to make firing solutions as difficult as possible. Hard brakes, vertical reversals, the kind of violent maneuvering that had been killing Soviet pilots in reverse over the Yalu. The exercise had 2 phases. Phase 1 was the control. The experienced aggressor pilots flew their evasive profiles, while 2 Navy pilots with conventional gun sights attempted to generate firing solutions. Gun cameras recorded everything. Phase 2 replaced the conventional sights with a 4-equipped aircraft. Same aggressor profiles, same evaluation criteria. Phase 1 lasted 22 minutes. The gun camera footage was analyzed immediately on the flight line. The conventional sight pilots had generated 7 firing solutions against 43 valid engagement opportunities, a success rate of 16%. This was considered acceptable by prevailing Air Force doctrine. These were experienced men flying against difficult targets. There was a 40-minute break. The aircraft were reconfigured. Draper stood on the flight line and drank terrible coffee from a paper cup and did not speak to anyone. Phase 2 began at 10:43. Delaney's aircraft lifted off first. He climbed to 15,000 feet and waited for his aggressor. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. When Delaney landed and the gun camera footage was pulled and reviewed, the room went quiet in a specific way that rooms go quiet when something expected has failed to happen. In 4 minutes and 30 seconds against a combat-experienced pilot flying maximum evasion, Delaney had generated 11 firing solutions. 11. The aggressor pilot, a Korean veteran named Hollis, who had been doing this for 2 years, climbed out of his aircraft and stood next to it and stared at the gun camera printout for a long time without speaking. Vogt and Simmons produced similar numbers. The aggregate for Phase 2 was 31 firing solutions against 43 engagement opportunities, a success rate of 72%. Against the conventional sights, 16. Admiral Pauling looked at the numbers for 30 seconds. Then he looked at Draper. How fast can you scale production? The answer was 18 months for full fleet integration given existing manufacturing capacity. Pauling nodded once. He turned to his procurement staff and used a single sentence that his staff would later describe as the most efficient authorization they had ever witnessed. Fund it full scale immediately. Colonel Marsh Colburn's observer wrote a 1-line report back to his general that afternoon. The demonstration was conclusive. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Within 3 months, the Navy had authorized production contracts that would eventually put the A4 system and its direct successor, the A4B, into every carrier-based fighter in the Pacific Fleet. The Air Force, facing the political reality of a Navy program that was generating documented kill ratios their own procurement chief had refused to fund, reversed Colburn's decision by April 1952. Full expansion was authorized. Production targets were set. Training programs were written. The system moved from Korea to the Pacific Theater training commands and then back to Korea in larger numbers. Pilots who had spent years developing instinctive deflection shooting found themselves relearning how to fight. Not all of them adapted willingly. Some senior pilots physically removed the radar ranging units from their aircraft, calling them distractions. Some refused to trust the floating reticle, insisting that it lagged and lied. The resistance was real, and it cost time. But the combat results were not ambiguous. Squadrons that fully integrated the A4 system and trained to use it correctly were posting kill ratios that made the early numbers from MiG Alley look modest. Soviet pilots began changing their tactics in visible, desperate ways. They stopped the deep penetration sweeps that had defined MiG Alley's early months. They climbed higher and stayed there. They refused engagements that brought them below 40,000 feet, where the Sabre pilots operated most effectively with the sight. The zone, as the Soviets called it, was expanding. but in a damaged MiG-15 that limped back across the Yalu River on a March afternoon in 1952, a Soviet pilot named Volkov carried something that nobody on the American side knew about yet. He carried a gun camera film canister that had survived the engagement, and on that film, captured in the final seconds before he broke away, was a clear image of the inside of an American cockpit. The glowing reticle on the glass, the black box behind the armored panel, the radar intake in the nose of the Sabre. That film canister arrived in Moscow 6 days later, and when the engineers at MiG-17 developed the images and spread them across a light box, the most dangerous intelligence operation of the Korean Air War began. The Soviets now knew exactly what they were looking for. They knew it existed. They knew roughly where it was mounted. They needed one intact unit. They were about to get it. By the spring of 1952, Charles Stark Draper's A4 gunsight had moved from laboratory concept to combat-proven weapon system. Soviet pilots over the Yalu River were dying in ways that defied their training manuals. The kill ratios were climbing. Admiral Pauling's Navy procurement had broken the institutional logjam. Full-scale production was authorized. The black box was going to war in numbers. But a film canister had arrived in Moscow. Soviet engineers had seen the glowing reticle on the cockpit glass. They knew what they were hunting. And now, in the spring of 1952, they began hunting it with everything they had. The intelligence report that landed on General Lobov's desk in March 1952 was the most detailed assessment the GRU had produced since the war began. It identified the radar intake in the Sabre's nose. It described the gyroscopic unit behind the armored glass panel. It estimated correctly that the system created an automatic firing solution that removed pilot skill from the equation. Lobov read it 3 times. Then he convened an emergency meeting of his senior flight commanders at Antong Airfield. And what he said in that room fundamentally changed the nature of the air war over Korea. He did not tell his pilots to fly faster. He did not tell them to fly higher. He told them to destroy every F-86 on the ground before it could take off. Reconnaissance photographs had identified the primary Sabre operating bases at Kimpo and Suwon. Lobov's new doctrine was simple and brutal. If the American machine was too dangerous in the air, kill it on the runway. In April 1952, Soviet-directed ground attack missions against American air bases increased by 340% compared to the previous quarter. 12 separate strike packages were dispatched toward Kimpo alone. Most were intercepted. Several were not. On April 9th, a low-altitude strafing run destroyed 2 F-86 on the Kimpo flight line and damaged 4 maintenance hangars. It was the largest single-incident material loss the 5th Air Force had suffered in 3 months. Simultaneously, Lobov issued a tactical directive that his pilots called the dive prohibition. No MiG-15 was to descend below 38,000 feet unless holding a minimum speed of 550 knots and a specific altitude margin above the nearest Sabre formation. The directive was based on an accurate analysis of the A4 system's operational envelope. At very high closure speeds and extreme range, even the gyroscopic computer had insufficient time to generate a stable solution. Lobov was trying to keep his pilots outside the zone by staying fast, staying high, and refusing the kind of sustained turning engagements where the A4 was most lethal. Soviet loss rates in April dropped by roughly 30% compared to March. The doctrine was working. And this created a new problem that nobody in the American chain of command had anticipated. The A4 sight had been optimized for a specific engagement profile. Medium-range sustained turning combat, the kind of extended maneuvering dogfight where the gyroscopes had time to settle and the radar could maintain a stable lock. Lobov's new high-speed slashing tactics, diving at extreme velocity and immediately climbing back to altitude, were generating engagement geometries that compressed the entire firing window to under 2 seconds. At those closure speeds, even the A4's gyroscopic computer was producing solutions that arrived half a second after the target had already passed. Pilots were firing perfectly on the dot and missing by 30 feet. The sight was not failing. The physics of the new Soviet tactics were simply outrunning the computational speed of a 1952 analog gyroscope. The failure reports from Korea reached Draper in Cambridge in May 1952. He read them in his office late on a Tuesday evening, and he sat with them for a long time before he reached for a pencil. The problem was solvable. He could reduce the gyro-damping fluid's viscosity to accelerate the settling time. He could modify the radar ranging algorithm to project the solution further ahead. It required a hardware modification that would take 4 months to implement across the existing fleet. 4 months during which Soviet pilots would be exploiting the gap. His program manager called the next morning and told him that General Colburn's office, reinvigorated by the production reversal he had been forced to accept, was now distributing the failure reports internally with a cover memo suggesting the A4 expansion had been premature. The political war inside the Pentagon was still running parallel to the real one over Korea. Draper flew to Washington. He spent 3 days in meetings he described privately as the most exhausting of his life. He was 46 years old. He had been working on this problem for 8 years. And he was sitting across tables from men who were using his system's temporary tactical limitation as a retroactive justification for the procurement decisions they had already been forced to reverse. He made one argument, and he made it repeatedly. The Soviet tactical adaptation proved that the A4 was working. Lobov had changed his entire operational doctrine to avoid it. You do not reorganize your entire air force around an enemy weapon that does not frighten you. The modification would close the gap. 4 months. He needed 4 months and uninterrupted production. He got the 4 months. The modification reached Korea in September 1952. The adjusted site was designated the A4B. The viscosity change in the gyro fluid reduced settling time by 0.3 seconds. The radar algorithm now projected the solution 0.4 seconds further into the target's flight path. On paper, these were small numbers. In the air at 600 miles per hour, they were the difference between a ghost bullet and a direct hit. October 4, 1952. The sky above the Chongchon River Valley at 41,000 feet. Clear. Visibility unlimited. Captain Ralph Gibson leads 16 F-86 F Sabres north in a combat air patrol, the largest single sweep the 5th Air Force had launched in 6 weeks. Intelligence has placed a major Soviet formation conducting a training sweep in the corridor. Gibson's 16 aircraft are divided into 4 flights. Every aircraft carries the A4B modified sight. Every pilot has completed the updated training syllabus on the new algorithm. Gibson himself has 41 combat missions and 2,200 flight hours. He is not exceptional. He is representative. The Soviet formation appears at 43,000 feet. 32 MiG-15s, 2 full regiments descending in the new high-speed attack configuration that Lobov's doctrine prescribes. Fast, steep, minimal exposure time. They are executing the dive perfectly. The briefed counter is already in Gibson's mind. Do not try to turn with them. Do not try to climb with them. Force them through the engagement at medium speed, where the A4B's extended projection range creates solutions they cannot outrun. The MiGs come down. Gibson calls the break. 16 Sabres split. The sky becomes a geometry problem. The first MiG commits to its dive at 560 knots. Gibson rolls in behind it at 500. The closure is fast. The diamond floats right. He follows the dot, pulling the nose left and down, fighting the G-load that is trying to gray out his vision. The radar locks. The diamond steadies. He fires. Short burst. Half a second. 18 rounds. The MiG's left engine nacelle erupts. The aircraft rolls inverted. It does not recover. Gibson is already off right looking for the next target. His wingman Lieutenant Carver calls a kill from the 3 o'clock position. A second MiG is streaming fuel. It turns for the Yalu. The engagement lasts 9 minutes and 40 seconds. It is not a dogfight in any traditional sense. It is a series of slashing passes executed by American pilots who are trusting their instruments and Soviet pilots who who are flying a doctrine designed to minimize their exposure time, a doctrine that keeps them moving fast and in predictable high-energy arcs that the A4B's extended projection algorithm was specifically modified to solve. When Gibson lands at Kimpo and the gun camera footage is analyzed, the numbers are stark. 16 Sabres had generated 53 firing solutions in 9 minutes and 40 seconds against 32 MiGs flying maximum performance evasion. 12 confirmed kills. 7 probables. American losses 0. Not one Sabre is hit. Lobov's high-speed slashing doctrine, the tactical adaptation that had partially blunted the original A4, is broken against the modified system in a single afternoon. The after-action report travels up the chain of command. It reaches the Pentagon within 48 hours. It reaches Draper's desk at MIT 3 days later, forwarded by Thomas Reedy with a one-sentence cover note. The modification works. Ralph Gibson sends his regards. Draper keeps that note. He puts it in his desk drawer and does not show it to anyone. The October 4th engagement does something beyond its immediate tactical impact. It establishes in documented operational data that the A4B system has completely closed the high-speed closure problem that Soviet doctrine had temporarily exploited. The modification data is immediately transmitted to every A4-equipped unit in the theater. Within 3 weeks, every modified sight is installed. The tactical window that Lobov had identified and exploited for 6 months is shut. The Soviet response is visible in the operational records. MiG sortie rates in October 1952 drop by 28% compared to September. The deep penetration sweeps into MiG Alley the aggressive territorial dominance that had characterized Soviet operations in the war's first year essentially stop. The 64th Fighter Aviation Corps is flying a reactive defensive war. They are responding to American incursions rather than initiating them. The airspace above the Yalu, which had been genuinely contested for 18 months, begins tilting definitively toward American control. By December 1952, 5th Air Force Intelligence is tracking a pattern in Soviet pilot behavior that they describe in their reports as altitude sanctuary dependency. Soviet pilots are refusing to descend below 42,000 feet, regardless of tactical opportunity. They are watching American formations operate freely below them and declining engagement rather than entering the zone. The psychological impact of the A4 system, which had begun as confusion and whispered mythology in Soviet mess halls, has hardened into institutional doctrine. The entire Soviet Air Army in Korea has reorganized itself around the imperative of avoiding a piece of equipment the size of a shoebox. The B-29 bombing campaign, which had been largely suspended since the traumatic losses of late 1950, resumes limited daylight operations in the spring of 1953. Not because the MiG-15 is no longer dangerous. It is still faster, still climbs better, still carries heavier weapons. But its pilots will not come down to engage the escort Sabres, and without that engagement, the bomber formations can operate within acceptable risk tolerances. The strategic mission that the entire air war had been fought to protect is partially restored. The A4 gunsight does not win the Korean War, but it gives American air power back the operational freedom that the MiG-15's arrival had taken away in October 1950. Draper receives the Collier Trophy in 1953, aviation's most prestigious annual award, for his work on inertial navigation systems that grew directly from the floated gyroscope technology the A4 had demonstrated in combat. The citation does not mention Korea specifically. It does not mention the zone, or the October 4th engagement, or the 16 months of institutional combat it took to get the system into full production. Award citations rarely mention those things. Draper accepts the trophy at a dinner in Washington and gives a speech that is technically precise and emotionally unrevealing. He thanks his team at MIT. He thanks the Navy Procurement Office. He does not mention General Colburn. But the story of what Draper built, what it proved, and what it cost to prove it does not end with an armistice in July 1953. Because the technology that had solved the hardest math problem in aerial combat was about to solve a harder one. The floated gyroscope that had put a glowing dot on Soviet fuselages over the Yalu River was the direct ancestor of something that would guide American missiles from submarines beneath the ocean to targets thousands of miles away with an accuracy measured in feet. The black box that had confused and terrified the Soviet military establishment was about to become the foundation of the most consequential navigation technology in human history. And Charles Stark Draper was already working on it. The story of the A4 gunsight ends in Korea. The story of what it started has never really ended. And there is one final chapter almost entirely unknown about the men on both sides of that invisible line in the sky. What happened to the Soviet pilots who flew against the zone? What Draper said privately about what his machine had done, and what the Cold War's most expensive technology race ultimately revealed about the difference between a system that wins battles and a civilization that wins wars. That chapter is the one that changes everything. From a cluttered laboratory bench in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Charles Stark Draper had built something that the most powerful military machine in communist history could not understand, could not copy, and could not defeat. His floated gyroscope, his ranging radar, his glowing orange dot had transformed average American pilots into precision instruments of destruction over the frozen skies of Korea. The Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps had reorganized its entire operational doctrine around the imperative of avoiding a shoebox-sized piece of analog engineering. The October 4th engagement had proved the modification worked. The air war over the Yalu was decided. But the armistice of July 1953 raised a question that the kill ratios and gun camera footage could not answer. What happened to the man who built the Ghost Draper returned to MIT in the autumn of 1953 as a full professor and director of the Instrumentation Laboratory, which is exactly where he had been before the war began. There was no parade. There was no press conference. The nature of his contribution was classified at a level that prevented any public acknowledgement of the specific role the A4 system had played in the air war. He received the Collier Trophy that year for inertial navigation, which was the publicly acceptable face of the same gyroscopic technology. He shook hands at a dinner in Washington. He gave a technically precise speech. He went back to Cambridge the next morning on the 6 a.m. train and was at his desk by 9. His colleagues at MIT described him in the years after Korea as a man who seemed simultaneously proud and restless. Proud because he knew with the complete certainty of documented operational data that his system had worked exactly as the mathematics predicted it would. Restless because the problem he had solved in Korea was in the architecture of his thinking a relatively simple problem. He had solved ballistics at Mach 0.9. The problem he was already working on in 1953 was guidance across intercontinental distances. The floated gyroscope that had put rounds into MiG fuselages at 1,200 feet was in Draper's mind merely the proof of concept for something vastly larger. General Colburn retired in 1954 with full honors. His official biography mentions his contributions to Air Force procurement modernization. It does not mention the 11 months during which his office blocked the expansion of the program that was winning the air war over Korea. Admiral Pauling, who had authorized full-scale production after watching Lieutenant Commander Delaney generate 11 firing solutions in 4 minutes and 30 seconds, was promoted to Vice Admiral in 1953. Thomas Reedy, the young major who had walked out of Colburn's office with the feeling of watching something important die, eventually made colonel and spent the last years of his career as a liaison between the Air Force and MIT's Instrumentation Laboratory. He and Draper had lunch together roughly once a year for the next 2 decades. By all accounts, they talked mostly about gyroscopes. The Soviet pilots of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps came home to a reception that was complicated in the specific way that Soviet military homecomings were complicated. They had fought well. Sutyagin, the top ace of the conflict, had confirmed kills that any air force in the world would have celebrated. But the 64th had also presided over a strategic defeat. The MiG-15, which had been the Soviet Union's ace card in the proxy war, had been systemically outperformed by a machine that the Soviets had dismissed, then failed to understand, then failed to copy. The pilots were not blamed publicly. They were simply not celebrated. They returned to their bases, and their families and their careers continued, and the official record of the air war was adjusted to reflect the version of events that the Kremlin found least embarrassing. But the real legacy of the A4 gunsight did not live in award citations or Soviet debriefs. It lived in the technology that grew directly from Draper's floated gyroscope technology that would spend the next 7 decades reshaping warfare navigation and eventually the daily lives of every person on the planet. The A4's core innovation, the gyroscopic measurement of angular rate, combined with radar ranging to produce a real-time predictive solution, was the direct ancestor of the fire control systems installed in every American combat aircraft that followed the F-86. The F-100 Super Sabre, the F-4 Phantom, the F-105, Thunderchief over Vietnam all carried gunsight systems that descended in a direct engineering lineage from Draper's 1952 modification. By the time American pilots were flying combat missions over North Vietnam in the mid-1960s, the computational sophistication of their fire control systems was orders of magnitude beyond what had confused the Soviet military in Korea, but the fundamental principle was identical. Measure the geometry, calculate the solution, show the pilot where to point. The floated integrating gyroscope itself traveled even further. Draper's laboratory at M1T developed the technology into inertial navigation systems that could track the position of a moving vehicle, submarine, or missile with no external reference whatsoever. No radar, no radio signal, no star sighting. Pure dead reckoning through the accumulated measurement of acceleration performed by gyroscopes built to tolerances that the Soviet factory system never successfully replicated. The Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile deployed in 1960 used an inertial navigation system that was the direct descendant of the A4's gyroscopic core. It could travel 1,500 miles underwater, launch a missile, and deliver a warhead to within a quarter mile of a target it had never seen. The mathematics were the same mathematics Draper had been solving since 1944. The scale was simply different. By 1975, inertial navigation technology derived from Draper's work had been adopted by the air forces of 31 countries. The systems had guided approximately 4,200 combat aircraft across conflicts on 4 continents. The civilian applications arrived later, but spread further. The inertial measurement units in modern smartphones, the MEMS gyroscopes that tell your phone which way it is oriented, are the great-grandchildren of the floated gyro that bewildered Soviet engineers in a Moscow laboratory in 1952. Every time a navigation system calculates your position without a GPS signal, it is solving a version of the same equation that Draper solved over MiG Alley. The ghost in the machine has been with us ever since. The deeper lesson of the A4 story is not about gyroscopes. It is about the specific human difficulty of accepting that a problem you have been solving one way for your entire career might have a better solution that you did not invent. General Colburn was not a stupid man. He was not corrupt or malicious. He was a man whose entire framework for understanding air combat had been built in an era when the pilot's instinct was the decisive variable, and when someone presented him with evidence that the decisive variable was now a piece of equipment, his institutional identity rejected the evidence before his rational mind could evaluate it. This pattern appears everywhere in military history. The French cavalry commanders who dismissed the machine gun. The battleship admirals who dismissed the aircraft carrier. The bomber generals who dismissed precision guidance. In each case, the institution's investment in the existing paradigm was so deep that the evidence had to be overwhelming and undeniable before the change was accepted. In Korea, the evidence cost lives for 11 months before it became undeniable enough to overcome Colburn's resistance. Draper understood this. He wrote about it privately in letters and lab notebooks that were not declassified until the 1990s. He was not bitter about the institutional resistance, or at least he did not express bitterness in writing. He described the resistance as structurally predictable and therefore personally manageable. What bothered him in the notebooks was the 11 months. He calculated in a notebook entry from 1954 that the delay between Admiral Pauling's authorization and the point at which the A4 system would have been deployed under an unobstructed procurement timeline represented approximately 40 additional pilot deaths that the system could have prevented. He did not show this calculation to anyone. He wrote it once in pencil in a notebook that sat in a filing cabinet at MIT for 40 years. Now for the detail that most people who know this story have never heard. In the spring of 1991, a retired Soviet engineer named Viktor Semyonov published a memoir in Moscow covering his work at NY-117, the research institute where the captured A4 site had been dissected in 1952. Semyonov had been a junior engineer on the team tasked with reverse engineering the gyroscopic unit. His memoir, which was never translated into English and received almost no attention outside specialist Soviet aviation history circles, contained a single paragraph that reframes the entire story of MiG Alley from the Soviet side. Semyonov wrote that when the NY-17 team finally got the intact A4 unit working, powered up in their laboratory in early 1953, the chief engineer stood in front of the glowing reticle for a long time without speaking. Then he said in Semyonov's recollection words to this effect, "We did not lose because they built this. We lost because they built 10,000 of these and believed in them before they had proof." Semyonov wrote that no one in the room responded to this observation. They went back to work. The meeting continued. But Semyonov remembered it for 40 years through the rest of the Cold War, through the Soviet Union's collapse, through the cargo cult of technology theft that defined Soviet military industry for 3 decades after Korea. He remembered it because he believed writing in 1991 as the Soviet Empire was dissolving around him, that the chief engineer had identified the actual cause of defeat in one sentence. Not the gyroscope, not the radar. The willingness to mass-produce an unproven idea and trust the mathematics before the politics had finished arguing about them. From a mathematician's instinct and a spinning top suspended in specialized fluid, Charles Stark Draper built the weapon that broke Soviet air doctrine over Korea and planted the seed of every precision guidance system that followed. He took an impossible math problem, the problem of where a bullet must go before the target gets there, and he solved it in analog hardware at a time when the digital computer did not yet exist, in a form small enough to fit in a cockpit. The A4 gunsight flew in combat for the last time over Korea in July 1953. The principle it demonstrated flew in every conflict that followed, and it flies today in systems that Draper could not have imagined from his Cambridge laboratory, though he would have understood every line of their mathematics. The Soviet engineers who stood around that wooden crate in Moscow were looking for a superweapon and found instead a mirror. What the mirror showed them was not the future of American technology. It was the present condition of their own civilization. A civilization that could build a magnificent aircraft but could not build the fluid to suspend a gyroscope. A civilization that could steal the blueprint but could not manufacture the precision. A civilization that had built its economy for gross tonnage in a century that would be decided by microns. The most dangerous weapon in the Cold War was not a missile or a bomb. It was a small spinning top floating in oil inside a black box, asking a very simple question of everyone who tried to understand it. Not how do you aim, but do you have the precision, the patience, and the institutional courage to trust the answer when the machine gives it to you? The men who said yes won. The men who said no lost. It has always worked exactly that way, and it always will. If you know another story like this one, a piece of forgotten engineering that changed the course of a war, leave it in the comments. These are the histories that disappear if no one keeps telling them. Subscribe to stay with us for the next one, because there are hundreds of black boxes still waiting to be opened.